Do people become wary of you when you introduce yourself that you're from a law background or a legal background?
I mean, anytime I say law and I'm managing partner of a lawyer, I get, ooh, okay. And I was really known, I mean, even throughout my entire schooling, as the girl who would stand up for others, the girl who, had a voice and demanded to be heard. And so the clients who haven't listened to my advice and gone about their own way and haven't done most of, say, what we've advised them to do, they do generally come back and say, we wish we had finalised that co-founder agreement when you drafted it. The issue with law is you never know what is going to be a priority for you because the landscape's always changing.
We don't see many of the women in your field when it is compared to marketing or HR or any other.
I don't see them either. No, I'm joking.
Legal, this word always rings a bell in your mind, and in most cases in not a very positive way. But this very word sets the ground for a lot of things in the business. There's an old saying that you must maintain a distance from a lawyer, but today we are going to unleash the real power of law and lawyers. My today's guest is the managing partner of Legal Circle, a firm that helps startups, SMEs, MNCs to navigate their legal and regulatory landscape. Welcome, Suraya, Turk. Thank you very much for making it. I welcome you on my show.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for making it. Without wasting much of the time, we would like to understand more about Suraya. Who's Suraya?
My name's Suraya Turk and I'm the managing partner of Legal Circle, which, as you introduced, is a budding law firm, if we can put it that way, like budding entrepreneurs that really aspired to grow with the entrepreneurs that we work with and to help them to build and create scalable businesses they can really be proud of. And we do that in the capacity of law. So we help them and partner with them to give them the best legal advice that we possibly can for them to scale their businesses and to grow.
Do people become wary of you when you introduce yourself that you're from a law background or a legal background?
I mean, generally the consensus is yes. I mean, anytime I say law and I'm managing partner of a lawyer, I get, ooh, okay. And it depends. If I'm speaking to a startup, you can tell the ones that tread cautiously. And often it's the commercial aspect around hiring a lawyer that is their main concern. Like, ooh, what's it going to cost me? Is it going to break the bank? Can I afford it? I need it, but can I afford it?
Yes.
Or is it a want or a need? And I think that's what sometimes people conflict with. Do I actually need a lawyer? Or do I just want a lawyer? Can I afford a lawyer? And so there is a mixed response, yes.
Mm-hmm. So if you want to understand, what inspired you to be a lawyer, right? Because in your profession, we don't see many women around, right? So we would like to understand more about it.
Yeah, well, I guess it really started a very long time ago. So I have to say, I think I was in grade 6 and my mother bought me a book which was about a little hedgehog that went to court. And so the entire story was this hedgehog and he goes to court with a little girl whose parents are going through a divorce. And she obviously doesn't understand the legal process. It's very, very scary. She goes into the court system and it's all about how overwhelmed she is. And the story is the story of the journey of the hedgehog and him educating this little girl about the legal process. Okay. And I just remember thinking, wow, I mean, even in the pictures of the book, there was images of like the judge and the jury and the lawyers wearing the wigs and, in the common law system, they got the fancy outfits and the gowns. And it really opened my eyes and I thought, wow, that process of, just journeying with somebody, and particularly this hedgehog and the little girl, and understanding that legal process and then just the formality of the whole setting and how empowering it was. I remember being really inspired. And obviously, though, I'm in grade 6, so it didn't mean very much then. Yeah. But that story did stick with me. And then as I got older and older through high school, I did lots of public speaking gigs, so lots of debating, and I got really, really passionate. And I was really known, even throughout my entire schooling, as the girl who would stand up for others, the girl who, had a voice and demanded to be heard. She was not going to back down. If she thought of something and she thought she was right.
Very demanding.
Exactly. I would stand for it. And I always also stood for the underdog. So if there was anyone I ever felt was disadvantaged, disadvantaged, I was always there to represent or be the voice for people that didn't have a voice. And advocacy became then very much a passion for me. So by the time I started looking into careers and what I wanted to become, it became very obvious. Advocacy was something that I loved and something that I was good at. Helping others is something that had to be in the career that I was going to pursue with it. So it really, when I put that all together, it was law. Law was the answer. Yeah, law was the answer. It allowed me to talk, it allowed me to have a voice, be the voice for others, and to help really where I could. So
Great. So as you know, our show is all about how do we decode growth and how do we help budding entrepreneurs to start their journey and help them grow, scale up their businesses, whether it is in the terms of legal, all of those different steps, right? So what are the key legal steps involved when you're sort of thinking to start a business, registering your business, getting some permits, because it's a lot of legal hassle around it. So if somebody is new to the country or somebody who's just starting up, how they should go about it?
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, where are they setting up? But I'm assuming the question is in the UAE or in the Middle East, and looking at,
UAE. Let's take an example of UAE first.
Yeah, example in UAE.
Yeah.
So the first thing in the UAE is to know that if you're going to be generating revenue from a business source, then you need to be registered and you need to have the relevant license. And so one of the first considerations is where to set up that license or that business, in which free zone.
So the legal structure comes in play.
Exactly. So the absolute first thing is licensing requirements, because before you can generate revenues or invoice anybody, you need to have the license.
Yeah.
So in the UAE, the question is of jurisdiction. We have over 45 free zones. We have mainland. And really, depending on the nature of your business, that will dictate a number of different free zones or whether mainland is the preferred option for you.
So if we can take one example of a real case scenario, when you say if you are into a trading business and you're just exporting or importing, whatever it is. So if you could explain with one example, a real case that might help the viewers.
Yeah. So for example, if we looked at exporting and importing, the question is really, is that company or is your business designed around importing the product, clearing it through customs, then exporting, is it going to be outside of the UAE or within UAE? And if it is within the UAE, to whom within the UAE? And these questions are very important, because if you're going to be doing that end-to-end service, then what you really want to be doing is perhaps being on the mainland, because the mainland allows you then to directly, to import and then directly export that to others, within the UAE. Okay. And so you're probably, with that line of business, going to need a mainland. So even if you had free zone for some other parts of the business, because generally that's what we see, some clients have a mix of free zone and mainland. But if we just take the importing, exporting business, for example, mainland would be a preferred option.
And does it also impact the tax obligations?
Yes, absolutely. So there are taxes now in 2023. As you know, they've been introduced. We don't have the full executive regulations around the treatment of the different free zones and mainland, but we do know that there will be a 9% corporate tax rate for companies. It was generally, first it was in the mainland, but now they've widened that. And so it's really important to look at what the treatment of the different companies will be, whether in mainland or outside of mainland, for tax purposes.
Great. So another thing is, when I talk to my fellow entrepreneurs, right, and when I ask them about the legal stuff, most of them tend to not to have a legal firm around them or the legal stuff around them, because that they think that it is a costly affair, right? So is it really a expensive or a costly affair, or is it a myth? Right? Because you might look at a business transaction worth $1 million dirham or 100 million dirhams or whatever it is. And then you might look at the legal expenses or the risk around it. And then you need somebody to support in your drafting your contracts or the legalities of this. So how do you sort of see that?
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, the way I look at lawyers and their cost is, yes, perhaps they do add a layer of cost. I'm not going to say that we don't, right?
Yeah.
Lawyers, the entire business model is around time. Time is money. So therefore, if we give you our time, our knowledge, our experience, our expertise, in return, our exchange is money. And obviously, when you're a startup and you're very cost conscious, you don't want to add that layer. The thing is, though, that's a very limited way of looking at lawyers, because the idea of lawyers is to help you mitigate risk.
Yeah.
And risk is generally translated into money. So when we're helping you mitigate risk, we should be in the long term helping you to mitigate either loss of money because, for example, you've not set up correctly, or you've not the way that your infrastructure is being set up now needs to be changed because of a deal, for example, that you're going to enter into, but they want that to be designed a little bit differently. So imagine you've got the cost of opening, closing, restructuring, negotiating, hiring,
and
firing costs, restructuring.
To add an activity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea of a good lawyer is really to help you set up right, then mitigate risk along the way, which ultimately should translate into helping you to save money. So, it may be an upfront cost now, but in the long term, it should pay off.
Okay.
should pay
on the
off.
similar line, my follow-up questions would be that the people who sort of tend to, keep aside the legal part of it, they commit some early stage mistakes, those lends them in the trouble. So what is your take, and how do you say, okay, these are the top 3-4 things which somebody should consider so that when starting up, they don't get into a trap?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I even see it with lots of our clients now, particularly the ones who are startups who, when I did tell them, register a company, register a holding company, make sure you've got your co-founder agreements in place, make sure all your investor agreements are in place, make sure everything is signed, make sure that all the pieces to the business tell the story, and tell the story in a very linear and logical way, so that when you're setting up this business for sale or selling up this business for further investments, that it's very clear, it's very transparent, and you're likely then to attract investment into your company. And so the clients who haven't listened to my advice and gone about their own way and haven't done most of, say, what we've advised them to do, they do generally come back and say, we wish we had finalize that co-founder agreement when you drafted it. We wish we had set up the right structure. Now we're entering into, for example, accelerators and incubators, but we need a holding company quickly. We need it overnight. Oh my goodness. They want to make sure that we've got a co-founder. That's a prerequisite for entering into the program, but we don't have one. Or, and I'm using that example because it's the most recent example of just last week, where I had a founder in a mad panic to have all of this suite of documents finalized. And we had to work overtime to get that happening. And that was really an issue of something that they kept deferring because of, either being cost conscious or because it wasn't a priority at the time.
Right.
The issue with law is you never know what is going to be a priority for you because the landscape's always changing, business is always changing, but you just want to be ready. So, yeah.
So, as you rightly mentioned, you've been discussing a lot of deals, valuations these days, and I'm sure you must have consulted more than hundreds or thousands of startups or the companies. But looking at the current scenario, do you see the terminology which is being used, funding winter, is it affecting the startup ecosystem here in this part of the world?
Yes.
Over the globe?
I know. So there is always this doom and gloomy term of VC winter.
Yeah.
But I think what it is now is just that investors have become much more savvy. Investors are much more conscious of the environment that we're in. And I guess the global economy and the impact that has had overall on businesses, and not just startups, but even MNCs. So, we went through a very hard period of COVID. We saw lots of restructuring happening, even in, multinational companies, all the way through to startups. And so I don't think it's necessarily a VC winter. I do see that there are startups still raising funds, but there is less of them raising. And the ones that are raising do have a very robust business model. So those that are raising do have a very good story, a good model, a good financials, and good supporting evidence for why an investor should invest.
Okay.
And I think this is the key. And I laugh because I tell this story all the time, but I once was speaking to a VC actually not that long ago, about 2 years ago, and he said, oh, look, 2 years ago we were investing in flying pig elephants, but we don't do that anymore. And I think that just the fact that that has now changed, people are calling it a winter, but I really think it's just that they're becoming more savvy. They're making more strategic, intelligent financial investment decisions about what is the actual scalability and profitability of startups that they're investing in.
So we don't see many of the women in your field when it is compared to marketing or HR or any other.
I don't see them either. No, I'm joking. No, I'm joking.
So, but what we would like to understand and what viewers would be interested in to knowing that is when you pitch to a client or when you pitch to anybody, do you face challenges due to your gender?
Well, I actually have to tell you the story of how I won over a client one day, and I think this will answer your question.
Okay.
So I was actually scrolling through LinkedIn, and a client had a post that he was looking for Harvey Specter and a Mike Ross.
Okay.
So you could just imagine, right? So he says, if you think you're Harvey Specter, if you think you're Mike Ross, we're looking for one, so reach out. And my response to that post was, well, if you're looking for a Harvey Specter and you're looking for a Mike Ross, then you're missing the opportunity to work with Jessica. And then it was really funny. So he laughed and he said, DM me your details and let's have a chat. Yeah. And that ended up being a long-standing client who I worked for about 2 years. Okay. And I think even if you ask him today, he'd probably say I was good as any man.
So you're seeing women being smart in approaching these clients, or you being smart approaching these clients and get them on your side?
Yeah, I think there's a way to do business. And I do think that, yes, there are probably still, and I haven't looked at the stats, so I'm not recording them as these being official statistics, but I would say that there's probably still more males in the legal profession than there are women. And I think that's just because of the nature of the job. It's a highly demanding, highly stressful job. And particularly when you're looking at the investment landscape. Yeah. So the investment landscape, the business landscape, is very mentally taxing. Yeah. And I think that's probably just why we see that over the life of a lawyer, perhaps more females drop off. But I like it. It excites me, and I go for it.
So you were speaking a lot about startups, and when somebody is just starting, or what I think is when they start, they have a really good idea. That's what they think. And they come up with the innovation. So to safeguard those innovations, their intellectual property rights, is a crucial part of the entire story, right? So could you suggest some of the strategies which a startup founder or the founders should follow to safeguard their interest of or the intellectual property rights?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So IP is probably one of your biggest assets. So if you're in technology or you're in any field which relates to data or any tool or software where you're processing data or analyzing data, these are generally the areas now that are most important for IP. And protecting the IP. So what is it that you're creating that is going to add value in an industry that you need to monetize?
You're right.
And the solution is, and whatever that solution is what needs to be protected. Right. And so just the other day, I was sitting with a group of young people who are all in different technologies, who are all on different either softwares or devices or anything that they were creating. And IP was not even the main consideration for them. And I said, whoa, so let's take a step here. Yeah. You're onto something which solves a very big solution. And we don't have that right now in the market.
Right.
Your IP is going to be the biggest asset. Right. And when an investor comes, they want to make sure that you've protected that so they can then invest in the company that owns the IP and then monetizes it and therefore makes everybody profitable. So we see that in technology, even the scalability of those businesses are like 10x. But you're only going to get that if you own the IP and that IP is protected.
Yeah.
Because if it's not, then you become a little bit more vulnerable, obviously, and other people can either recreate or monetize it more quickly than what you can. And you cannot claim that if you've not protected it.
Right.
And so IP is definitely one of the biggest considerations. And there's different forms when we talk about IP. So we're talking about patents, we're talking about trademarks, we're talking about copywriting, we're talking about, anything that is going to allow you to have a claim and a right to what it is that you've contributed through, as intellectual property.
Are there differences between these when you're trying to protect your local IPs or you're trying to protect your IPs globally?
Yes, so there is a difference because with the IP, when you're, like, for example, if we take trademark, just because you're registered and protected in the UAE, it doesn't mean that you're registered and protected across the Middle East, for example.
Yeah,
so every jurisdiction you would need to trademark in to be able to protect that IP. And again, globally. So there is a Madrid protocol, which allows you, for example, to go onto one platform and try to trademark, for example, but they are still separate applications and then there's an additional cost to each of those.
Okay.
So it's just important to remember, just because you've trademarked in one jurisdiction, you're not covered globally.
Right. I'll move towards contracts.
Okay, contracts.
I think contracts help in shaping up the overall business relationships. The drafting and the negotiation becomes extremely important. Drafting is one part which lawyer can help. I think negotiations, a lawyer and the person who's negotiating it. And so I think it's a tri-party thing.
Absolutely.
Those three of them have to come to a consensus. They say, okay, yeah, this is what we want. So what would be your advice to the people when you're drafting or negotiating contracts, And this I would like to ask in the 4 different aspects. Okay. So one is for the investors. And then we'll go to the founders and partner agreements. We go to the client agreements and we go to the vendor agreements. So we'll start first with the investors agreement.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think just as a blanket comment on that topic of contracts, I think as a lawyer, my rule of thumb is you should never write for nobody to understand or draft so that nobody understands. Ultimately, the role of a lawyer is to draft the terms and the commercials that 2 parties agree on. And those 2 parties should very well understand what those commercials are. So there's no point in saying these are the commercial terms, and then you get a lawyer who drafts fancy terms that neither party can understand when there's a dispute or, for example, when they need to turn to the contract. So the first thing is contract should always be written in simple, clear, and concise terms so that anyone who picks it up, they don't need to be a lawyer to understand it. Because ultimately a lawyer's role is only to reflect the position of the parties in the contract. Sometimes, yes, we draft it so it's more in favor of one, but that's why there's an obligation on the other party to have his own lawyer to be able to negotiate those terms.
They become 4th party.
Exactly. So that's just a general, I think, my view on contracts and how they should be drafted. Now, when it comes to an investor, investors tend to want to draft a contract so that it's in their favor.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? It's just business and it's just the landscape where we see that more often than not. Sometimes they're very fairly drafted, but more often than not, we see an investor wanting to protect his interests and his rights. And that's not unreasonable because when an investor is looking at a contract or making money, an investment, ultimately the goal is to have a return on his investment. And the way to make sure that he's going to get that return is to have clauses in there that protect his interest.
So what would be those 2 or 3 things when a founder or the partners are deciding on the contract or when they sort of draft their contract, they should keep in mind?
Excellent. So from a founder's perspective, what you want to do is make sure that you're not being watered down so much so that ultimately, I mean, even though that dilution is a natural progression and part of the process, you don't want to be watering yourself down in the very early days. and you don't want to give yourself less power. So some of the clauses or some of the protections that you want to be putting in there are going to be around your seat or your involvement, for example, in boards or making the commercial decisions of a company. So the strategic, business decisions that are going to affect and impact
and
the growth and the scalability of the company. Correct. And as a founder who's a very vested interest in that, you want to make sure that your voting power or your position is still heard. So you want to, be able to negotiate those into the contract. So that's not unreasonable. But then again, how do we, for example, if we've got an even number of people on the board, how do we navigate a dispute situation where, for example, there's a deadlock position where we don't see eye to eye? There's two founders and there's two representative investors and we don't agree.
Right.
Who is going to be the chairman? How do we resolve that dispute? Do we have equal weight? Do we have an independent party that's going to decide on that? Or do I, as the founder, with X% of the shares, then have the casting vote, for example, or have the chance to ultimately decide that veto power, exactly. And so these are I think, the most crucial decisions, particularly early on, because that's going to steer the business and steer where it's heading, which ultimately is going to impact the investment as well for the investor.
I interact with a lot of founders and startups, and I happen to see two cases wherein there were three founders in each companies. And exactly three in both the startups.
So each had equal power?
Each.
Okay.
So one startup had three founders and the startup had three founders. And they're running, they're still running a good business. But until last year, they were not writing their designation in the email signatures. They all were writing co-founder.
Okay.
Right. So I thought, what is that? And what is your view? So because I'm coming to the transparency, I'm coming to the decision-making piece and the roles and responsibility part. So do you think defining designation at a very early stage is very crucial for these startups?
To me, the answer is always yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Everything should be clear. The roles, the designation, the sweat equity, how much are you going to get for what your involvement in the company is. Everything around a co-founder's and the co-founder's engagement should be very, very clear. And it's not uncommon that we see all the time, founders start out with the right attitude. They start out with their heart in place and they start out with the view to being, very ambitious and working. But the reality is that there's life. Life happens and circumstances might change.
Yeah.
And one might become more involved and one might become less involved, or one has a strength. Right. The others doesn't have the same strength, but has it in a different area. And so then there starts to be this little bit of a tug of war.
Yeah.
And I think if that is not navigated or preempted and clearly, put out in the open and discussed, there's going to be issues. So for me, prevention is better than cure. And you may not see or preempt all the issues that may arise, but the best thing to do is work with an experienced lawyer who's at least seen more issues than perhaps you have.
Have mentors around
Exactly. Or have mentors around you, absolutely, who can then tell you what it is that you need to be considering and put those into the co-founder agreements so that at least you've got a framework and a skeleton to be able to navigate when things do start to get a little bit rocky.
Have you explored any innovative way of handling these legal issues, or have you ever thought of that the use of AI and automation would have an impact on the lawyers?
Yeah, well, it's definitely having an impact. I mean, personally, I don't think AI and softwares are going to completely replace what lawyers do. Maybe the low entry level jobs, which can be automated, systemized, that can be taken away, for example, or not taken away, but that can be done more efficiently through the use of AI. But I think that really top level, that really strategic level where a lawyer's role is so crucial. And I think this balance and interactivity between making a decision now and also for the future is not something that AI is going to replace overnight. So I think on the really top strategic level, There always need to be a human element, but are we using AI to review contracts that we've drafted for, say, grammar errors and wording that could be made more succinct? Or yes, can AI improve language? Can it, pick up on errors that you may have missed through human error? Absolutely. And do we use those tools? For sure. ChatGPT now, I think most people are using. I even have to ask people these days. I forget to use it sometimes, but I ask people, that was quite well drafted. They said, yeah, well, we drafted something, put it into ChatGPT and it reworked it a little for us. And, I'm actually having these conversations with people now, which are quite interesting that's just one example of a tool.
Have you come across, or your take on investors trying to be owner in the companies, right? When they invest something, they try to overrule the founders. So your take on that?
Yeah, we've seen that. It's not uncommon that an investor who's investing a huge amount of money wants to have a huge amount of control in the company. And as I was saying earlier, it's not unreasonable, but sometimes, and I think where the conflict is that an investor is looking at the business and looking at the ultimate goal quite differently from the founder. Mm-hmm. So the founder's ambitions is not always just perhaps to make money, whereas an investor's ambition, more often than not, is to. And this is where the conflict happens. Do they try to take ownership or more control? Yes. Now, when we're looking at ownership and control, there are two different ways. So we're looking at ownership through a shareholding capacity, where you actually own more of the company. And then there's a lot of control through being, for example, on the board, where you have control over decisions that are being made. Because don't forget, as a shareholder, you may own the company, but not have a lot of control in the company if you're not in the operations or you're not on the board and deciding on those very strategic operational decisions. Mm-hmm. And so we often find there are different type of investors and who have a different appetite or ambition, but the ones that, yes, want to own and control definitely can be a little bit overpowering and overbearing, but often you'll find they get into conflict with the founder. And this is where, depending on who we're advising, we need to step in and start to put some controls back.
So do you say the vision alignment is very important for both of them?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's always to begin with the end in mind.
Thank you very much for answering all my questions so patiently.
You're very welcome.
I'm sure the viewers are going to just love it, and it has got so much depth into it.
Thank you.
Now we'll start with a rapid fire round.
Okay.
You'll have to be on your toes and answer all these questions either in one line or one word.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. That's a bit hard for me to do, but okay. I'm going to try.
Let's create some excitement.
Okay.
How do you unwind?
I don't.
You don't? Oh, okay.
No.
You prefer working with startups or MNCs?
Startups.
Okay. One piece of legal advice you would like to give to all the entrepreneurs?
Build your team. Build a good team, a solid team around you.
Okay. Your favorite legal jargon?
Favorite legal jargon? Deal closed.
Okay. One common misconception about the law or the legal, which you would like startups to debunk?
That law is not a necessity and not a priority because it costs too much.
Okay. A book or a resource, or of law or entrepreneurship, which you would like every entrepreneur to read and understand?
So I recently read Shoe Dog, and I think that's a good one.
Oh, okay. If you weren't a lawyer, what would you have done?
I'd be a professional public speaker speaking to thousands of people.
Okay. Do you think AI will replace lawyers?
No.
No. Great. Thank you very much. Now my last question to you, which I'm going to ask my next guest. And this question would be from you. And you don't know who's that guest. And they don't know who asked this question.
Okay.
To be asked in my next episode.
I'd like to know their thoughts on what they think is the most important criterion to success for startups and for growth.
Okay.
What is the number one thing that they recommend that one must focus on to grow
Okay.
and to scale and to be successful.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for such quick answers in my rapid fire round.
You're very
Thank you very
welcome.
much for
Thank
being
you for
here.
having me.
And I'm sure audience is going to love it. Viewers, you have had a good engaging session.
Thank
You've
you so
learned a
much.
lot about the legalities of the businesses. And I'm sure they're going to utilize this, some of it, if not 100%.
I hope so.
You know? And if required, they might take your advice as well.
Yeah,
You know?
always open to it. Thank you
We'll
so much.
see you in the next episode. Please do share some love with us. Do subscribe to my channel, share, comment, like. Please do subscribe. And also let us know who should be the next guest in our show. Till then, thank you very much. I'll see you in my next episode. Bye-bye.